Well, welcome everybody as you're joining. Hi, Dean. Hi, Scott, Rachel, Daniel, everyone, welcome. And welcome to our APCO community webinar on managing productively through a crisis. So for those of you that haven't joined these webinars before, we just ask that you mute yourself and we'll mute ourselves and use the chat box if you have any questions. So muting yourself, that's just on the left-hand corner. Use the chat function for any questions that you have today. So like we said, if you can just go ahead and put your name and your company that you're joining us from in the chat box, that would be great. There's also a reaction button on Zoom that you can use. And if there's anything that you really like, feel free to give us a thumbs up or a clap. And also this session will be recorded and made available. So if you want to share it with anyone else on your team, you're welcome to do that once the session is recorded and released. And if you do have any technical issues, feel free to contact Alison Appleby from APCO, who you see up there, and she can help you get sorted out through the chat box. All right. So for those of you that I haven't met before, my name is Meredith Epp, and I work on our APCO member services team here at APCO. And then this is the first time joining us here for the webinar. Thank you for taking some time today. And if you missed some of the earlier sessions, those recordings will be made available online this week. So this is the 5th webinar in our APCO community series. And there are really 2 key purposes for these sessions. One is to provide our members and stakeholders with the latest information and research to help you achieve the 2025 national packaging targets and create a circular economy for packaging here in Australia. And those have been demonstrated through the previous webinars, which last week was on recycled content. The week before that was on the Australasian Recycling Label Program. The week before that was the launch of our Packaging Future, which is the roadmap to the 2025 national packaging targets. And so we've had a number of sustainability-based sessions, but the second purpose of these webinars is really to support our members and our wider network to meet the needs of the community. And so we're really excited to kind of have a guest speaker here who I'll introduce you to in a second. But in the spirit of collective impact and knowledge sharing, I'm just going to ask a quick question of everybody as we go through, and you can just respond in the chat box. So as we try and help support each other and have this sense of community, my one question before we get started would be, what's one thing that has helped you through these challenging times? So maybe it's going for a walk before and after work, maybe it's a new book or a podcast that you've been listening to, or perhaps it's being able to have video calls with your friends and family. Let's just use that chat box. If you have any tips and tricks that you think that you can share with everyone that's on the call today, we'd love to hear that, and you can hopefully connect with some other people through that chat box there. So we're really conscious that basically everyone on Earth at this point has been impacted by this global pandemic. And in one way or another, really now more than ever, we need to come together to continue to support each other, not only with this important work on sustainability, but also in ways in which we can adapt to the current situation. Well, that's why I'm really, really excited to introduce our guest speaker for today. So Nina Mapson Bone from Beaumont People. So Nina is the Managing Director from Beaumont People. She's also the President of the Recruitment, Consulting and Staffing Association for Australia and New Zealand. So Nina has been supporting a variety of organizations as they transition to these new ways of working. And today she'll share some insights for you to manage productively in a crisis. So Nina, we'll go ahead and hand over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for having me, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. As Meredith said, we're in the very privileged position, if you can use those words at the moment, of working with thousands of organisations across all sorts of different industries. So we have been able to see what people are doing and how they're reacting quite quickly. So and one of the things as a recruitment company is that we spend our time talking to leaders and to job seekers to find out what's not working and what is working. And so that does give us some insight into some of the best practices we're seeing out there. So as a result of that, we've been in the lucky position to be able to share some of those ideas. So I'm going to talk for maybe 20 minutes or so, and run through the key things that we're seeing, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers towards the end as well. So as Meredith said, if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and then we can come back to them towards the end of the presentation. So just to start off, this is sort of what we're going to cover. It's a deliberately messy agenda because we're in a messy world, right? So unfortunately, there's no structure at the moment, but we really want to talk about how do you get the best out of your people at the moment. And it's a completely different environment we find ourselves in. I imagine a lot of you have moved to working from home, as I clearly am in my very messy home office, and I can see Meredith is. I'm sure a lot of you are working from home full time. Some of you might have shift systems going on. I know I work with somebody in one of the big manufacturing plants, and they're still very much processing that they're having to rotate their staff around. So everybody's sort of adapting and trying to find new ways of doing this. So regardless of how your workplace has changed, we know from everyone we've spoken to that it has changed. So everything we touch on today is going to cover off on how you can still try and get the best out of your people, the ways in which that's changed, and how you can try and get the best out of them in those scenarios, covering off some of those areas you can see on the screen there. I'm going to talk very briefly at the beginning about technology. Now, I just want to caveat that with I am probably the least technological person you'll ever meet. So this is not my area of expertise, but I just need to call it out because obviously we've all had to adapt to technology. If you'd told me 4 weeks ago that I would be doing 3 or 4 webinars a week, I would have laughed at you because I hadn't done a webinar in my life. I'd done lots of public speaking, but I'd never actually used the webinar technology. So we've all had to adapt quite quickly to how we're doing things. And I'm sure you've already done all this now. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just if you are still sort of trying to work through some of the technology piece, just what we've heard from most of the organizations we deal with is that where possible, if you're implementing new technology, try and make it something that's easy and intuitive and already established. It might be that it has to be a new technology, but trying to take on a brand new big technological project at this time is probably quite tricky. You will need to have videoing, messaging, some sort of collaborative tools, and ideally it can integrate with your calendars so that you can, or have a calendar function so that you can help manage work and sequence work. But just have a think about that when you're looking at your technology. There's loads out there. I'm not particularly wedded to Teams or Zoom. I'll tell you why they're up there in a minute. There's loads. There's Slack, there's Trello, there's all sorts of things. There's a company called Zapier that have a really good document on their website, Zapier, Zapier. They have been working remotely for years, and they actually have a whole document around getting the best out of remote working, and I've certainly read that cover to cover, and they've got some really good tips and tricks in there. So as I say, there are people far more knowledgeable than I on technology, but obviously to make this work, to be productive, you do need good technology. I've only called out Teams and Zoom for 2 reasons. One is because Microsoft Teams you're probably already paying for. If you have Microsoft Office, it's already included, so there's no need necessarily to pay on top of that. And given that a lot of organizations at the moment are quite concerned about their costs, some people aren't aware. I'm still coming across people that aren't aware that that's included as part of their Microsoft package, and it does have all of that functionality that's mentioned above. And Zoom is the other one, just because there is a free element to Zoom. It does cost if you want to have longer time and more people, but it's not cost prohibitive. And they have increased the security functions. There were some concerns about security, but as long as it's used properly and used appropriately, I think it's a reasonable tool. So, but again, not wedded to them, but just to really have a think about that. And I had to touch on that first before we get into the managing productivity and really keeping your people going, because if you don't have the right technology, it becomes very hard. We have all been forced into a position where we've had to embrace the technology. That said, I'm going to assume you've got that part side done, and if you haven't and you need help, I can point you in the direction of people that can help you, but I'm definitely not that person. Let's get on to instead your people, because that's where I want to spend the bulk of the time. How do you get the most out of your people in this kind of environment we find ourselves that's constantly shifting, and how do you ensure that you can get the most for the business and also look after them and keep your organizations going? So there's some technical things that you've probably already thought about, but you do need to think about first if you have got people working from home for the first time, and that is that you do still have a health and safety obligation. The same obligation that you would have in your normal work environment applies if somebody is consistently working at home. And so just in case you're not aware of that, just be across that. There are enormous amount of templates available. A lot of, I actually don't know, I should have checked APCO if you've done this, but a lot of associations have provided templates for people from a work health and safety perspective from the home environment. But if not, organisations like Employment Hero, who are an online HR tool, they're providing templates from work from home, just so you can make sure that you've ticked off the actual safety. And it's important because we know a lot of people, Meredith and I were just talking in the sort of preamble then about people having to share environments. I know more than one person that's using an ironing board with a laptop on it as a stand-up desk. And so, you know, we do need to think about how are we making sure that we're still looking after the work health and safety of our employees. So obviously from a legal perspective, but also from a physical perspective for them as well. So you need to tick that box first. But where I want to spend the bulk of today and really get into is to talk about how we keep our people mentally strong. Because we know, and we all know this intuitively as leaders, we see it in all the surveys, that stronger mental health makes more productive people. And we know that that's intrinsically true. But we also all know that this is a time where that is challenged for some people. And I think there's sort of three aspects that we need to think about. We know that some of our people that work with us will be in really very isolated. If we're in a situation where we're kind of obeying the lockdown rules and we're not going out, we might have people that are living alone and they're getting very little interaction with others at all. Or we might have people that they're maybe not living alone, but they're not near their family, or they're not near the people whose relationships give them kind of a sense of security and a sense of self. And they're not, a lot of those people that aren't kind of, that have living environments where they don't get that, often get that from their working environments. And right now they're maybe not getting that support in the same way from their working environment as they would have done under the traditional circumstances. So isolation can be a big issue, as can vulnerability. I'm sure you've all seen in the news the reports, and we do quite a lot in the charity section. We know from our clients in that space that there are increases incidents of things like domestic violence and mental health issues. And so that there is an increased level of vulnerability, and we may not know how that's impacting the people that work in our organisations. And they may not be willing to tell us, and obviously they're not obligated to tell us. But what we do know as leaders is if we can help them, and if we can help them be mentally stronger, then they will perform better. So we need to think about those aspects. And we also need to acknowledge, and I'm sure certainly this is true of me, and I'm sure it's true of all of you on the call, that all of us have probably had heightened levels of stress and anxiety over sometimes. And there are some days where I think to myself, that's great, I'm on top of it now, I know exactly what I'm doing. There are other days when, you know, and sometimes it's a work thing, sometimes it's a family thing, things fall apart and suddenly we think we can't cope again, and we might read what's happening. And so it's a very emotional time for people. And again, this will be affecting all of your people. So there is going to be a general level of heightened stress and anxiety that your people are dealing with, which is going to impact on their productivity. And then they're working in an environment that they may not usually work in, which is dealing with change, which makes it difficult as well. And one of the things that we're noticing when we talk to leaders out there is that there sort of is a continuum that we seem to be falling on between being a manager and a counsellor, and we're not quite sure where we sit on that continuum as a leader in an organisation. And it's, I guess it's important to try and recognise that. Now, I do want to call out that obviously if there's a point at which you have a concern about someone's mental health that is above and beyond kind of a general level of anxiety, please do refer them to the professionals. You know, unless you are a qualified counsellor yourself, do make sure that you're encouraging them to seek professional support if that is what is needed. But I think the point really that I'm trying to make is, assuming that we're not talking about that level of help, you're probably going to need to spend more time kind of going down that counsellor continuum than you would have done previously. And for some of you, that's going to be more natural than others. Some of you will be kind of, that will be more in your skill set, others it won't. But it's also not aided by the environment we find ourselves in. It's much harder, and we'll get onto this in a minute, to do when you're all working from home, or if you're working shift systems when you're not always in at the same time as other people. So trying to just bear that in mind. So let's take a look at some of those things and see how we can, what we can do to try and help people with their mental health so we can help them be more productive, and then how we can actually lift the productivity from there. So the first thing I want to think about is that human connection. So you will all know that human connection is really important, and I would love to get to you to encourage you to make sure your people have a human connection, encourage them to have fun. This doesn't necessarily need to be within the work environment, but it is to your and your organisation's benefit if they are doing this. Now, those of you that are sharp-eyed might notice that I am in that awful picture on the side of the screen there. I'm not going to tell you which one I am, but this is something some of the people in our team set up. They decided literally after a few days of us all working at home that we were probably all indulging in too much chocolate and a little bit too much wine in the evening, and it might help if we had a group workout on a daily basis that we could all do together. And so our team have this at 9:30 every day, and you know, you don't have to go, but anyone that's free can go. And as you can see, none of us are in time, but we're all trying to do certain exercises. Mel, who's the lady in the pink sort of t-shirt standing up, she gives out the exercises and times us, and we all do the exercises together, and it's quite good fun. But actually what's really nice about it is it encourages us to have a chat with each other in a way that's not work related, and encourages that fun and that activity. Things that I've heard other people do, other organisations. One of the CEOs I was talking to the other day was telling me that he has taken to 3 times a week. He's taken to putting it in everyone's diary and saying that he's going to be in the lunchroom for lunch between 1 and 2 p.m. and he sends out a Zoom link and he opens it up and he says, no obligation to come, but if you come, there's no work chat. I'm in the lunchroom, I'm having my lunch, I'm having my break. If you want to come and just have your lunch with me and have a chat with me, you're welcome to do so. And he's actually had really good engagement with that, and he's found that it's been a really good way for people. He's been quite surprised by those in his organisation that have joined him for lunch, and those that, you know, have chosen not. He's been quite surprised by some of the conversations that come up because of the no work chat rule. It's really helped engage that human connection, and we're really missing that at the moment. I think we're missing the small talk that we used to get, you know, how was your weekend, and oh, what happened with your dog, and you know, all the little chit chat that we used to get in the same way. So encourage your team to do it, encourage them to do it in work, encourage them to do it outside of work. There's loads of things now, and I'm sure you've all, you know, seen enough out there, but I was involved in a trivia night, just on a Saturday night. Friends of ours, they had 7 families with screens and slides and fancy headgear and all sorts of things, you know, but it was really good fun, and it did make us feel like we actually had a night out, even though we were all in our own homes. So share ideas and get your team doing it, and even if it's external, it's going to help them internal. So the other one you can see on the screen there is a online Pictionary game that you can play. So there's various different ways you can do this, but explore those and encourage your team to do it. If you had any kind of social club in your previous work environment, these are the kind of things you can think about doing and getting creative. And it's not something that you as the leader has to do. This is the other great thing. You can charge someone in your team, you know, with doing it, with being the social club secretary and coming up with new and fun ways, and it's amazing what they come up with sometimes. So I think first of all, that tries to help overcome that isolation issue as much as possible, whether it's internal or external, but it's going to help your organisation. Then I want you to have a think about how you can control your internal environment. Now, this is for both yourself and for your teams, and this is assuming that you're working from home. So for the people that are working shift systems, it might be a little different, but what we're seeing is that most people are working from home at least some of the time where they haven't had to before. And it takes some adapting to do, and different people work in different styles, and so it can suddenly become quite challenging to do. So I think one of the things that we realise, and in talking to other people, we realise that there are some certain things that you need to think about that will really help control the internal environment. And we notice that organisations that and people that do this are doing better, and those that resist it actually probably need it more. I don't know how many of you have toddlers or have had toddlers, and you know that actually routine is the best thing for it, and even the ones that resist it are the ones that probably need it more. So it's the same now. When we have no control over what's happening in our external environment, the more we can control our internal environment, the more that gives us a sense of security, and that sense of security can make a big difference to our mental health. So encourage your teams to have routine and structure. Encourage them to keep to sort of calendars. Now, I'm not saying it has to be exactly the structure it would be before. One of our managers, for example, he's got 2 young children. He's working from home. His wife is working from home. We've agreed a system where he works from 7 till 12. Then he takes the kids, she does the afternoon shift, and then he does the rest of his hours in the evening. You know, so we're not saying you can't be a bit flexible with it, but agree what the structure is and know so that there's some communication around that. And make sure that you design some sort of workspace. Now, this can be challenging. Not everybody has I'm lucky that I have a home office, and apologies for the mess, but I'm lucky that we have a home office environment here and I can shut the door. Not everybody has that. You know, as I said, I know people that have been working on the ironing board, or they've got kids at one end of the table and they're at the other, or, you know, they're working from their sofa, and it can be hard. But even if you can't have an actual workspace, I would encourage you to dedicate a space that's yours while you're working, and then to tidy it up at the end of the day and shut it up at the end of the day, so that you help with that separation between home and work. Because otherwise what happens is, when we're all at home, if we're working from home more, work can bleed into our home lives, and it can be easy, especially if we don't have a lot to do, to kind of think, oh, I'll just do a bit more, I'll just do a bit more, I'll just do a bit more. And the more we fall into that trap as leaders, the more our people are going to think they have to do that, which just adds stress to them. If they're getting they're getting emails from us, say it. I actually had to have this word with my business partner the other day, emails at 4 o'clock in the morning. You know, if our brains are working and we're on crazy hours, I've got no issue. If you really want to work at 4 in the morning, feel free to work to your own body clock, but use the delay delivery button on your email so that they don't go out until a reasonable time, and kind of don't make sure that as a leader, you're not putting an expectation on your staff that's unrealistic when they've got enough stress at the moment. So have a think about that and how you're coming across with them. Attire is something we discussed after a week of having everyone work from home, that we felt that we didn't want necessarily everyone to feel like they had to be business outfits, but we did feel that perhaps there was a mental health benefit to getting dressed in some sort of appropriate way for work. And obviously your work, I've seen on the chat where you come from, you're all in different organisations, and some of you might even have uniforms and you might still need to wear them, and some of you might be going in or out of your workplaces. But I would encourage you people to dress. Maybe what we decided was our Friday dress code was okay. We went, you know what, we just don't want everyone in hoodies and gym kit, because there is a sense of, actually, if I'm at work, I want to feel like I'm at work, and it does make a difference to that mental health piece. And keep up your meetings and your schedules. 2 things that I do want to spend a bit of time on: recognition and celebration, and increased communication. So what we have lost when we're not working in the same environment we were before is we've lost that incidental communication. And that incidental communication was really important. You know, the amount of things I would find out when somebody would come up and think, oh, Nina, I'm not sure if you're aware, but Betty had a big argument with a partner last night and she's not in a good way today. And just those little sidebar conversations that make you, as a leader, make you think, oh, okay, I need to just be a bit gentle with Betty today, or try and give her a boost in another way. And, you know, or you overhear that a client's on the phone and they're upset about something, and you're able to sort of help solve the problem there. And then we've lost all of that incidental communication with the shift. And even those of us that are working, say, alternate teams on site, we've lost half of that incidental communication. And so we don't have the same level of flow of information coming through to us. And that can make a real difference. So on top of that, then, you add in the fact that we've also lost the ability to sort of just recognise and celebrate somebody as things happen in the moment. I know I used to, every morning, I used to walk around the office as soon as I get in and just say hello to everyone, have a quick chat. And you get a sense very quickly of whether they're in a good mood or they're in a bad mood. You can tell the body language, you know, and they might tell you a little story, and you might get to go, oh, that's great, I can't believe you did such a good job with that member, or you can't believe you did such a good job with that customer, or whatever it might be. And just little moments of recognition. Or then you might go, okay, I'll remember that and I'll bring it up in a meeting so I can publicly praise them. But we're losing that. So that's very motivational for a lot of your people. So you need to find ways to try and recognize and celebrate separately. So for example, one of the things that we've done is we've implemented Good News on a Friday, where we all have to join in via Zoom at 4:15 on a Friday with, you know, a drink of our choice. And it's funny because it ranges from everything from water to substantially more than that. And we all have to share at least 3 good things that happened that week. And it's just a really nice way to finish the week, and everybody gets involved and celebrates and recognizes each other. And when we're working at a time when it's probably more challenging than normal, more hard to find good things, it does sort of force you to think of good things that have happened that week and have finished on a good note. So think about the recognition and celebration, and think about how you can increase that communication. If you're not doing structured one-on-ones with your staff, I just would really encourage you to do it. If you are, make sure that they're structured and keep it going, and just really make sure you're getting that information through, because you're going to be lacking that in a way that you haven't done before. So just some tips there to think about. The other thing I know that was mentioned is that a number of you particularly might be bringing on new staff, and it's quite hard now. You might have had really good onboarding practices in place. You know, how do we onboard when everything's changed or we're working in a new environment? So particularly if you're working remotely, or if you're doing the rotation system and sorry, I've just gone too far, and you're not there to be onboarding with them all day every day. I mean, that's the other thing. You might only be there for half the time as their direct manager when you're onboarding them. So have a think about how you can adapt that. one of the things to do is to make sure that you welcome the person really well. So I've seen one organisation that we work with, they did a little video of everybody. They had everyone record a little video, welcome video, so that the person could see the video. Somebody else I know did a morning tea remotely, where everyone was, you know, doing their remote, and to make it fun, they did it because they've got quite an international workforce. They did everybody had to share a fact about their kind of country or town of origin, just to kind of help get to know each other. So have a think about how you're going to welcome your person. Maybe you might put together more of a welcome pack that you wouldn't have done previously, because you might have talked them through things. So do have a think about making sure they feel welcomed. And if you haven't already, I would definitely implement a buddy system, because most people, when they're new, they learn by sitting next to a person or talking to the person or bouncing ideas. Yes, they get the formal training, but that's kind of all the unwritten stuff. So your buddy can share the unwritten rules with them and can help them and be there and be available for them. If you have a buddy system, really important that you take the time to make sure your buddies know how it's changed, because otherwise they might kind of just go, oh, either I don't have to do it, or the way I do it as I did before, and they may not think for themselves about what they need to change in terms of how that works. So have a think about that. Use your technology, the online tools that you're using, they can be really useful. So most of these tools have really good screen share functions, or you can take control. If you're trying to show them something on a computer, you can take control of the screen and then you can click through and show them what you're doing. So make sure that you're comfortable enough with anything you need to show them remotely so that you can do it, or record a little video of yourself or a little dialogue talking them through what it might be, and just work out how you can make those online tools work for you. But the other thing I would say is put some really clear accountability in for the new person. They're going to want to know what's expected of them, and it's hard when they're not with you every day to know what is expected. So be really clear on expectations, and then finally make sure that you are available for questions. New people won't randomly just call you up. No matter how many times you say to them, please call me if you've got any questions, they're going to be nervous. They don't want to ask a stupid question. It's even harder when it's via a video call than it would have been if they just happened to bump into you while you were making a cup of tea in the staff kitchen. So make sure that you're kind of constantly checking in and you have that availability, and give them really good feedback so that they're clear on what they need to do. So taking all of that on board, both with new people and with your existing people, I just want to spend a moment talking about body language, because that's the biggest thing we've lost. Even now, and I'm assuming you can all still see my face, and I'm quite a kind of gesticulating person, you get a bit of a sense of my body language. But even with a video, you can't see down here, you can't tell if I'm slumped, you can't tell if my legs are crossed. If I fold my arms below the screen, you can't tell if I folded my arms. There's a lot you still can't see. And those of us that are old enough to remember before we had all this amazing technology will know that, I mean, I know I'm in this category. I used to be able to ring my parents and with one word, literally with hello, they would say, what's wrong? They could tell from my tone of voice that something's wrong. I think a lot of us lost that ability that we used to have because of the way technology has changed. You've really got to tune into that, and you've really got to turn that on, because you're not seeing people in the same way. And even if you are, we know technology can freeze. We know, I had a staff meeting the other day, I had 4 people and 4 faces on the screen like this, 2 off the side that I couldn't see, and the screen froze. And I'm running an idea, and I could hear them, the audio still worked. They were going, yeah, that's a good idea, but I couldn't see their faces. And I suddenly thought, I don't know if they believe it's a good idea, or if they're just telling me it's a good idea because I'm the boss. And losing that visual really makes a difference. So you need to be more conscious of that, and you need to think about how can you incorporate things into your working style to make sure that you've adapted accordingly. And that, again, really comes down to spending more time with people. And the last couple of things I want to finish on before we go to questions then is that in order to do all of these things, you need to lead by example. Because if you're not leading by example, people aren't going to follow you. And it's really hard at the moment. It's hard. That's hard at the best of times, but it's particularly hard at the moment. So you need to think about maintaining your own motivation. If you're doing all of this to try and motivate your people, but you're not motivated yourself, they're going to pick up on that, and they're going to get better at listening to tones of voice, and they're going to pick up on that as well. So I love the fact that Meredith asked at the beginning, you know, what are you doing to keep yourself going? Because that's really crucial. Making sure that you are, and if you are having a bad day or a bad hour, kind of finding the right headspace to either give yourself a break from it, or to be able to communicate it in a way that's appropriate. So one of the things is not to make promises you can't keep. We've had a lot of leaders ask us, you know, we know a lot of organizations that are having to cut back staff, or worse, in some areas they're having to cut back, but in other areas hire, which makes it very difficult to kind of get that message right. And, you know, we need to make sure that what we do is communicate well. So don't make promises you can't keep. Your people are going to be very nervous about their jobs. If they're saying to you, oh, is my job safe? Don't say, sure, absolutely, nothing to worry about, if that's not the case, because they're not stupid. But also you don't want to say, oh yeah, you should be really worried. I don't know what to tell you. I have no idea. You might not be in a job this time next week, because that doesn't help them either. So think about any messaging you give. We're doing everything we can. We're working really positively. Here's what we're doing to make sure the organisation is okay. Here's what we need you to do to make sure the organisation is okay. As long as we all work together, we see no reason why we can't get through this. That kind of communication, but really think about your communication. And it's been really hard. I think it's actually just got a little bit better in the last week or so, but the first few weeks of this, things were happening so quickly, and we were all having to communicate on the run, and we saw various things coming through from government on the run, that it was very hard to know how to communicate. So that made it even harder. So just really think about how you're coming across to your people and how that influences their productivity. And the final thing in terms of leading by example from your self perspective is think about where you sit on what I call the trust versus performance continuum. So some people as leaders will be naturally very trusting of their staff. They'll leave them to get on with it. Other people as leaders, just your style will be that you want to know everything that's happening so that you've got a sense of control and you can understand. It's much, wherever you sit on that continuum, it doesn't really matter. It's just that it's harder at the moment to know what people are doing because we're not in a work environment with them. So if you're at the trust end, you might be going, oh, they're fine, that's all right, they're doing everything, when actually they might not be. If you're at the kind of keeping an eye on the performance for everything they do end, you might be doing that so much that they feel micromanaged. So, and there's no right or wrong with this, but it's just understanding yourself to know how then to adapt when you're trying to motivate people in a remote environment, and being aware of that. So once you've done all of that, and they're all the things you need to do from a kind of internal and a leadership perspective and a helping your people, then you can think about how can you actually boost their productivity. And where we've seen companies do this well is where they've done all that pre-work. And where we see it working badly is when companies go straight to what I'm about to share with you now without thinking about those other things first. And that's often the mistake that we see leaders make. So there are some sort of practical things you can do to try and keep that productivity going when you're in a different work environment. And a lot of that does come down to practical measurement. And so you might, and depending on your organisation and the roles of the people that you're leading, there are all sorts of ways that you can measure that. But it now might be the time to put some kind of practical measurement in place, or to up it or to review it if you haven't done it already. And that might be a measurement of outcomes. It might be some sort of activity report around the kind of, if they're on the phone, or that, let's use Meredith as an example because I can see her face before me as a membership role. It might be how many membership conversations are you having on a weekly basis, Meredith. It might be, categorizing members by different groups and speaking to a certain number of this level and a certain number of that level, or how many activities are we putting on for our members. Or so thinking about the roles in your organizations and what is it you want them to do. And then having the tools and systems to track. A lot of you will also already have those tools and systems. You might have them in your CRMs or in your databases. But if not, it's very simple to build something in Excel quite quickly off that. But the key here to getting the productivity you want and to making it feel motivating for your team rather than kind of micromanagement is the communication. And what we're seeing work really well is when you talk to teams about, you talk to your people and say, look, we know that it's a bit harder to be motivated at the moment. We know that you're dealing with stress in ways that you haven't done before. We want you to finish your week feeling good about what you've done. We know that you're sitting at home worrying about whether your boss thinks you're doing a good job or not, or wondering whether or not your job's safe. We want you to finish each working week feeling like you've done a good job. So let's help you by talking about, what does a good working week look like? What would you feel? How would you finish your week thinking, yes, I've had a good week? I can't necessarily worry about revenue or results or outcomes in the same way because I don't have control, but I can measure what I'm doing and how effective I am at it, and that would make me feel good. And agree that with them and then measure that. So it comes from them. Some of your people will then give you nothing and you might need to boost them up a bit. Others will overpromise and will never reach it. So you can massage it a bit, but communicate with them through that. And then just to finish off, I put this up. I'm actually oversharing here, but I decided we're all in a world now where we're oversharing, right? So this is a poster I have on my wall in my office here at home, and I have it in the office that I haven't been to now for some time in the city. And this is about self-care. This is something I've had for years, but I think it's really important to remember. Meredith started this at the beginning by asking what you're doing to look after yourselves. And I think this is really important to remember, because the biggest tip I can give you about getting the best out of your people is that you can't do that if you're not looking after yourself. And the reason I have this up is that I have a tendency probably to overwork, and a lot of leaders do. And so particularly that third one, I put my own health and well-being first, because I cannot help others unless I'm at my best. It's really important to acknowledge this, and this is just pictures of family and friends, and I play hockey, as you can see. So, but really trying to think, how do we do that? And just remembering that actually self-care is not selfish. Self-care is the most selfless thing you can do, because then you can help up more people. You're no good to anyone if you're not looking after yourself. So I've gone through an awful lot very quickly there, and I could probably take each one of those points and talk just for an hour on any one of those points. And I know we're going to go to Q&A, but I did want to say I'll leave my details up here for a minute, because if we don't get everything covered, I'm very happy for anyone to contact me directly as well after this. But just some tips for you to go away and think, it's going to be different for each organisation, but hopefully that gives you some ideas and some things that you can think about in terms of getting the best out of your people. And I think now I hand back to you, Meredith. Do I have questions?
Yeah, well, we'll go ahead. So if anyone has any questions for Nina, feel free to pop those in the chat box, and we'll just kind of feed them through to you as they come along. We do have one that's kind of come through the chat already for you. So as communication moves online and we become more contactable, how do we manage not only external communication, but internal communications without overwhelming ourselves? There's just so many more channels, I think, out there at this point in time.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, and it's not something I forgot to talk about that, so it's really relevant. Is that one of the things to think about is that we do need to communicate more, but if we're not careful, and we definitely had this experience, we suddenly found that we were getting so many emails. Everybody was emailing about everything. Everybody was replying all, and that we were really we could just spend all day, every day responding to emails if we weren't careful. So we had a look at what we saw different organisations do. And one of the things that we did internally was we put some guidelines around which tool we wanted to use for which type of communication. And so, for example, we use Microsoft Teams, as I mentioned, and we say that the chat function in that is like our social media for the company. So that's where we might want to share funny stories or celebrate or recognise, but we don't expect people to respond to that if they're focused and they're working. That's not an immediate thing. We want to keep emails for actual kind of communication of information, but not for important discussions. What we also did, and we spoke to a number of leaders and looked at what they were doing. We had set up regular meetings with all staff. So one of the CEOs we work with in a different organisation, he had told me that what he has done is set up weekly town halls where he does it for all staff, open to anyone, and people can ask any question they want, just to really help keep getting the right message out there. But we found that actually for us that didn't quite work, because people still weren't necessarily asking the questions that we know they really wanted, because we still have not as good secret channels, but we still have some channels. So instead what we do is we actually set up 3 weekly all staff meetings. We always had a Monday morning one to kick a week off, and as I mentioned, the Friday afternoon one is just a celebratory. But we implemented a Wednesday, we've got one this afternoon, what we call a share and learn. And it is literally just, there's so many new learnings. We've actually cancelled our normal trainings because most of them are not necessarily appropriate right now. And we run this as in this new environment, what's come up that we've not dealt with before. And we use it as a group discussion. So it's not that one person knows best and we just share ideas, but it's also, we've been amazed at some of the things that have come out of that. And that's when the questions tend to come out that they won't ask otherwise, because they almost ask it as if they want to learn, when we know actually it's more of an emotional question, but it helps us deal with that as well. So I don't know if that helps with that.
No, I think that's fantastic. And I really like that idea of the weekly town halls. At APCO, we have our weekly staff meetings as well. And I know teams kind of are implementing some daily catch-ups also. And I like that idea too of the lunch hour, that creating that space that anyone can come and just chat, because when you're at the office, there's so much more opportunity for interaction, just bumping into each other.
And I can see, Meredith, that somebody's written on the chat function about repeated messaging. I'd really like to back that up, because we know instinctively that that's true, even in our normal work environments, that the message doesn't always come across the first time as it's intended. But we've certainly seen that both with organisations and with ourselves, that you probably need to repeat messages more now than you used to, and in more different formats and styles, just to try and really make sure that the proper intent and the proper understanding gets through.
That's a great one, and great question. Thanks, Jessica. We've got another one here from Anley. So Anley from DWX, thank you. So I've read that about 45% of people around the world feel like they're working more than before, and think this is because we were more contactable and we feel like we have more time. And the question will be, how do we flip this mindset for ourselves and for others?
It's a great one, and it's tricky. You know, I think that's why I was talking about the blurring. I've certainly been guilty of this. I was joking with somebody the other day that I don't think I've ever worked so hard for so little, and I'm actually very grateful for that, because unlike a lot of people, you know, I'm still in secure employment and I'm still very fortunate in lots of ways. But it is something we need to be careful of, and it can add to people's stress. So I think if you're a leader, that I think partly you need to set that example. So if you are tempted to work outside of hours, you know, you need to make that decision for yourself, but don't let the rest of your team see that you're doing that, because as soon as they see you doing that, that sends a message that they kind of expect, you might expect, even subconsciously, it sends them that message. And I think going back to what I said before about having that workspace and really trying to kind of shut down, and maybe even things like, you know, take your emails off your phone. If you've got a laptop and you're working off your laptop, you know what, when your laptop's closed, you don't need to look at it. So perhaps take the icon off your phone. I know that's scary for a lot of people, but, you know, often what happens otherwise is that we find that, you know, we might have had dinner and we're sitting in front of Netflix and we have a quick look at the emails, and then we get stressed or worried about something at 9 o'clock at night, and then we're worrying about it as we go to bed, and that's not healthy or helpful, and actually goes back to that self-care piece. It's not you at your best self when that's the case. So it takes discipline, and it's really hard to have that discipline when there's no one there to kind of enforce it. But maybe have a think about trying to do that, and I'm trying not to look at my phone after 8 o'clock in the evening. It's hard and I'm not very successful at it, but I'd encourage you to try and think about some of those practices if you can.
Absolutely. And it can kind of snowball potentially too, as you're more and more tired, then you feel like you're getting more behind, and just setting some of those clear boundaries seems to be pretty important.
And encourage that in your staff. Make sure that you're checking in with them and that you're making sure they're not doing that. And if they are sending you emails at night, or they're sending you through things out of hours, you know, tell them off for it. Why are you working? Stop working. Go and relax. Enjoy yourself, you know. And if they say, oh, I've got nothing to do, then give them 10 hobbies they could take up, and say, you know, I would challenge you for, in 3 months' time, I want you to come to the next staff meeting and play us a piano piece. Go away, you know, whatever it might be, you know, just, or knit something for charity, or whatever it might be. But try and encourage them to do something else.
Very good. Got another one coming in from Nars. This is a great question. So how can we help those living alone that may be struggling and not open to share?
Yeah, that is a great question. I actually personally had this exact scenario earlier on today. In fact, I was talking to someone who lives alone but had always told me they were fine, and I thought they were fine because they always seemed quite upbeat and everything. And this was not deliberate. I was not being a genius leader by any stretch, but I stumbled on a solution without even realizing that's what I was doing. So I happened to be telling her about somebody else that I'd spoken to at the weekend that lived alone, and how they were struggling with it. And by sharing that story, she suddenly opened up, having for weeks told me that she loved working alone and loved being alone and loved living alone. She suddenly opened up about the things that she was struggling with, just by me saying, I actually said to her, oh, you know, I was talking to somebody at the weekend and I thought of you, because unlike you, they're really struggling being on their own, and I know you're dealing with it really well, and this is what they're struggling with, and, you know, I know you're dealing with it well. What tips do you have? And she went, well, actually, I'm not dealing with it well at all, and she literally 3 days ago told me she was dealing with it really well. So sometimes that empathy with talking about somebody else in the same situation can make people feel more comfortable, because what that tells them is that you're not going to judge them, because you're not judging. They see that you're not judging the other person, so that might help. The other thing is, and you can't force someone to talk to you if they don't want to, but just keep asking them, you know, are you okay? Is there anything I can do for you? And just encourage that connectivity, and ask them, you know, what did you spend your weekend doing? And I'm sometimes surprised when you throw little ideas out there that people don't react well to being told what to do. But when you say, oh, you know, I was talking to a friend the other day and she did this, wasn't that fun? And then you find out a week later they did the same thing just because you happened to mention it in passing. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to share proper resources with them. There's a lot of the charities, I know we do a lot of work, say, with Black Dog Institute and Beyond Blue. A lot of the charities have got together, some of the mental health charities have got some really good resources that they've developed specifically for this time. So it's probably worth your time as a leader to familiarize yourself with some of those, and don't be afraid just to say, you know, you may not need it, and sorry if I'm overstepping the mark, and I'll never raise it again if you don't want me to, but just here's a link in case you want it. And for those of you that have got EAP programs, it's a really good opportunity, and I remind everybody so nobody feels singled out, but it's a really good opportunity to remind people of the EAP programs that you have.
And sorry, just for those who don't know what an EAP program is, can you just...
Yeah, sorry. So an EAP, it's a lingo, employee assistance program. So often it's a lot of the large organisations would have it where they might have an independent organisation that will provide counselling or kind of emotional wellbeing contact point. It's usually completely anonymous, so the organisation the employer has no idea who contacts the EAP provider. They just know that people have, but they don't know who has or what was talked about. So it's a great service to provide for your organisations. And if you haven't got one, some of you will, but if you haven't got one and you do have a little bit of funds, and I know that's tricky for a lot of organisations right now, but it is a really good thing to invest in if you can, because it does allow your people to have a conversation that they're not having to pay for or worry about or set up, but in a completely confidential way. And we have one at Beaumont People, because our view is that goes back to that stronger mental health makes more productive people, so we see it as an investment.
Fantastic, thank you. So we've got another couple of questions coming in. So one more from Lee. So Lee's asking, great to have these pointers regarding onboarding new team members. But do you have any team coaching resources or models which could seem to work better in this work from home context?
Yes. While I start talking, Lee, I'm just going to ask you to type a clarification mark, because I'm just wanting to know, when you say team coaching resources or models, are you talking about the style of coaching, or are you talking about the technology tools, or both? Just so I understand. So if you could just clarify that while I at least answer what I think you're asking. So there's two parts to that. With a technology perspective, you need to ensure that you're using functionality if you want it to be from a team perspective. So Zoom, for example, has breakout rooms and different systems, and we're all learning these technologies at pace, right? I know more about Zoom than I ever knew before. So but have a think about the technology, make sure you're using the technology. Then if it's about the actual style, one of the things that we lose in that ability to read body language and to check in is it's harder to read people's personalities, and particularly when they're new and we don't build that personal connection with them. You know, often if somebody's new, as we say, give them a buddy, we might take them out for lunch or a coffee and we get to know them. So you want to spend a lot of time as the leader, and encourage your team to spend a lot of time with them virtually to try and build that connection, that personal connection, so that you can get a sense of their style. Now, in terms of the actual coaching, I can't remember the name, but if you Google 4 leadership styles, it's a quadrant box system of the first one is really directive, and essentially goes through to much more hands-off. Now, when somebody is new, no matter how senior they are, you want to be really quite directive, because that's your opportunity to do so. They go from sort of hands-on directive, where you're quite directive, you're showing them, you're telling them, you're getting them to it. Then it sort of moves to a situation where you're telling them but you're showing them less. Then you kind of move to a situation where they might be doing it and you're giving them feedback on it and helping them to tweak it. And then the last box is they're pretty much self-sufficient, and you're just there to help kind of guide them around the edges. And ideally with your people, you want to get them up to that last box as quickly as possible, but depending on their seniority and their experience, they're going to move through that transition at different stages. But anybody new, and I even say this with CEOs, even a CEO with the board, they still need to go through that initial phase. With a CEO, it might only be a couple of days, but you need to go through that initial phase. So don't be afraid for your coaching style to be quite directive when they're brand new. And if the whole team is getting involved and you're the leader, you need to be quite clear on allocating who is directing what, so they're not getting mixed messages, and then work out the timing of how you can move them through those styles of coaching. And I'd recommend you Google that. I can have a look afterwards, Meredith, and find it so that we can email it out to the group if you like, but I'd recommend you look that up. That's quite a useful tool, and then you can sort of play around with how can you adapt that to an online environment.
Absolutely, and I think that's helpful. And then also, I've seen personally a lot of different courses that are coming through, lots of online courses that you've seen as well that have been made free or heavily discounted too. So maybe if it's something else that a specific skill where you could go online, if there's anything else or any other places you recommend, Nina?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of resources out there. Depending on the level, a lot of the leadership organisations, so the Institute of Managers and Leaders has some tools, the company directors has some tools. So there's different things out there, and a lot of the HR kind of leadership consultancies will have tools as well. So huge amount of information. In fact, I was just looking the other day, TAFE are organising all sorts of courses for free now, and I believe they've got some leadership courses on there for free as well now on the TAFE website. So there's a lot you could do to improve your own leadership skills and your own coaching skills. And I'm pretty sure with how quickly the world's moved to webinar, if you wanted to, you could spend all day every day watching webinars and become and upskill yourself in a really good way. So I think a lot of it is just about doing the research to find out what's out there for you. But there's, yeah, a lot of free resources at the moment.
That's it. We'll just take this one last question here. So Matilda's asked, with so much change in the last month, do you think it will be challenging for some people return to normal work following this? And do you have any tips to support this retransition?
Yeah, in fact, we actually just building another webinar on that at the moment about the sort of moving forward for the bounce back, I think we're calling it. It's not quite decided yet. But I think one of the challenges people are going to have is that we don't quite know what it's going to look like. I think most people are agreed that it won't look exactly the same. It might be for some organizations, but a lot, this has opened up a lot of opportunities. People have realized very quickly that perhaps they can be more flexible and they can work from home. And ironically, the working from home, the remote working suits some personalities much better than others. And so even things like when you're hiring new people, taking that into consideration and what that might mean in terms of the traits you're looking for might be slightly different. So there's an awful lot. It's a very big question. There's an awful lot to consider. But I think the first thing you need to think about is what is it going to look like for you? And that probably isn't resolved right now, but what is it going to look like? And then kind of building out some sequencing based on what you want it to look like in terms of what's changed, and therefore how do you need to adapt your leadership style, how do you need to adapt your hiring practices, how do you need to adapt your performance management practices, because there's going to be nuances to all of those things from a people perspective that are going to have to be tweaked. Not to say they have to be, but the better you do that, the more you're going to get out of your people, and the more you're going to rebound quickly, which is where the advantage is going to come from, from those that don't. So it's a great question. It's not an easy one to answer. Certainly something we could have a think about going into more depth into in the future if that's of interest. Meredith.
Absolutely. I think we might take you up on that. Well, Nina, thank you so much for joining us, taking some time and giving some insights on how I certainly found it useful on a personal level, and great to connect with everyone through these community webinars. So
you're more than welcome. And if anyone wants to further the conversation, as I said, feel free to reach out. Our contact details are on the Beaumont People website, so feel free to reach out or via LinkedIn. I'm very happy to answer any further questions people might have.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. And when you exit, Alison will be putting on a quick poll. If you don't mind, it'll take you less than 1 minute to just fill this out, but this will help us on future topics that might be of interest and just to kind of gauge how today's session went as well. So thank you so much, Nina, and thank you to everyone for joining us. And we hope you have a healthy and safe rest of the week. We'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.